Hey guys, this next lecture is about Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War period, and it goes with this handout right here that says, now what do we do with Reconstruction 1865 to 1877? This is a really interesting time period. You might think, well, since the North said the South never left the Union, then what's really why do they make them jump through all these hoops, or should they make them jump through any hoops to get back into the Union? And so there's going to be a real diversity of opinion on that, as you're going to see. And also it's not going to be very clear, well, who's in charge of deciding the process by which the South is readmitted into the Union? And we're going to get real diversities of opinions. We're going to get people like Lincoln who say, well, the South really never left, so they don't really have to do anything to come back. And then you're going to see other people like the radical Reconstructionists who are very upset about what the South did, and they want to punish the South and force the South to jump through lots of hoops to get back into the Union in good standing. So we're going to see all that diversity of opinion expressed in this lecture. So let's head right to PowerPoint and we'll see the specifics. Okay, so as I'm alluding to here, there's going to be a lot of different ideas about Reconstruction. And the first person who's going to make clear their sentiments about Reconstruction is Lincoln. Lincoln is it's going to be his opinion that he is going to control the readmission of the Southern states into the Union. And so his policy is one that's very lenient. He wants to be nice to the South, and he wants them to come back into the Union and as full states and active members of Congress as soon as possible. So his goal is to be lenient to the South and to quickly rebuild the Union. His plan is called the 10% plan. He basically said, we're going to look at the 1860 voting rolls of people who voted, and 10% of those basically white Southern men are going to have to show up in front of a federal official, and they're going to have to take an oath to support the Union from here on out. Now, 10% is a very low number. It's not a very demanding, requirement on the South to do this. Congress thinks that this is an outrage, that this is way too easy, that we should have not just 10% of Southerners promising to be loyal to the Union, but over half of them should at least be loyal to the Union. So you can see here that Lincoln is really not asking a lot of the South to re-enter the Union, and he's also not doing a lot to protect freed slaves. That was another fear that some other people in Congress had, is that we really needed to protect the freed slaves, and that it was going to be the job of the federal government to stand in and protect them, because it was quite clear that a lot of white Southerners had no intentions of really freeing their slaves and giving them full and equal standing in society. So you can see that Lincoln is so eager to get the South back into the Union and get the North and South reunited that he's kind of not saying a lot about what protections or accommodations are going to be made for black freedmen. So that's a little disconcerting. It's one of those areas where I'm a little kind of disappointed at Lincoln, to be quite honest. But that's just a reality of what his priorities were, I think, in terms of getting the country back together. So Lincoln is not able to get his plan really put into practice because he is assassinated, of course, in 1865. And so Congress is going to see this as an opportunity to put forth their own plan for Reconstruction. And that's particularly led by the radical Republicans. The radical Republicans are people who are the kind of more radical wing of the party of Lincoln. And they're going to be very harsh. These are kind of the former abolitionists in politics. They want to be very harsh to the South. Their leader is a man named Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was really quite radically, for his time period at least, dedicated to black equality with whites. In fact, he insisted that he be buried in a black cemetery just to show his commitment to equality. They wanted to punish white Southerners, and they wanted to empower freed slaves and protect them. So they come up with a proposal called the Wade-Davis Bill. And it proposed that it's not really the president who's going to run Reconstruction, it's going to be the Congress. And they said that 51% of former Confederates must take an oath of allegiance. They didn't like the 10% plan. They wanted more than half. And that's going to be quite a challenge to get 51% of Confederate men to come appear before a Union official and take this oath. Some would say it might be impossible, and then that would leave the Union in some kind of limbo. And it was unsuccessful because Lincoln this is actually before he was assassinated, he just vetoed the bill. He put it in his pocket and it expired. And so that was the attempt of the radicals to offer kind of a counter plan. And so Lincoln will be assassinated, their plan will have been vetoed, and Andrew Johnson is going to step into that gap as the vice president that becomes president. Now, remember that Andrew Johnson's position is kind of unusual. Lincoln had his first vice president have to resign, Hannibal Hamlin. And so he decided to make a conciliatory gesture to the South during the war and bring Andrew Johnson on as his vice president. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, and he had actually sat loyally in Congress throughout the war. And so it's kind of unusual. You might think that Southerners would be touched to have another Southerner taken on as the vice president, but a lot of Southerners considered Andrew Johnson to be kind of a traitor. And no one really expected that Andrew Johnson would actually be seated as president. So now there's a lot of speculation. Well, what is Johnson going to do? Is he going to be a sellout to the South and actually be harsh on the South? Or is he in fact going to be nice to them, since these are in fact, his people? He is a Southerner himself. And what we're going to see is a sort of surprising approach that Andrew Johnson takes. It's his intention that he's going to control Reconstruction, and basically you can call his policy lenient in that it was going to be fairly simple for the Southern states to get into the Union as compared to the Radicals' plan. He just said that each state needed to have a meeting where they agreed to get rid of slavery, and that just the meeting put forth a resolution that they promised to swear allegiance to the Union. So there was no percentage of the population that had to come out and vote or swear allegiance. Instead, it would just be declared by this convention or meeting. The goal was to get the North and the South into the Union and reunited as quickly as possible. But there's also this special clause in the Radical Reconstruction Plan that wealthy white Southerners needed to come get a special dispensation from the president to have their rights and property fully restored. What's really going on here is that, if you recall, Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he was a very poor man. He was an apprentice to a tailor, and he never properly learned how to read until he was an adult. And so he just really kind of carried a grudge against rich white people. So what he's basically doing is making it pretty easy for the states to re-enter the Union, but hard for wealthy people who had over a certain amount of money to be fully restored in terms of their role in society. And so he really wanted them to kind of come grovel at his feet and ask for forgiveness, and that was kind of a manifestation of his own personal vendettas in that sense. But technically it's easy for the states to get re-entered into the Union, and that's why people characterize this as lenient for the states, maybe not quite so kind to individual families or wealthy landowning families. Johnson also is quite a racist president. He really does not want to do anything to help protect or empower African Americans. So when Congress passes the Freedmen's Bureau, which was to feed and house freed slaves and poor whites and kind of provide for their material comfort in this time of transition, he vetoes that. And then they also passed a Congressional Reconstruction Act of 1866, which provided for civil rights protections for African Americans to kind of make sure that they were African Americans were given some level of protection from state laws, and Johnson, he vetoed both of those. So Johnson very quickly kind of hooks himself up to the veto wagon, as they say, and him and Congress square off against each other. Congress is really outraged by his Reconstruction plan and his taking over control of Reconstruction during a recess time when Congress is not actually in session. What happens then is we have what are called some midterm elections in 1866, and that's when the president is not up for re-election, but a good percentage of Congress is. All the House of Representatives are up for re-election, as well as select senators. So what happens in that case is that the radicals get two-thirds control of both houses of Congress, and suddenly whatever Johnson vetoes, basically they can override it. So this is going to be the time period where we have what I call Congressional Reconstruction, where the president had a shot at it, but now he's going to be basically silenced by a congressional two-thirds majority. So what they go about doing is basically undoing what Johnson had done. They want to be very harsh on the South during this time period. They press upon the South the 14th Amendment, and it has three parts. The first thing that the 14th Amendment declares is that blacks are citizens, and therefore they should have all the protections of citizens. And that protection should be equal, that blacks have the exact same rights and protections as white people. And that had not been explicit, especially since the Dred Scott ruling had said that blacks were not citizens before the Civil War. The other lesser-known part of the 14th Amendment that you might not have studied quite in as much detail in civics and economics is that it banned Confederates from voting or holding office. So there were a lot of white former Confederate soldiers who suddenly could not vote and could not hold office. And there were a lot of freed blacks now who could. So after Congressional Reconstruction starts, you're going to see an outcry from a lot of white Southerners that basically we have black rule in the South, that there's going to be a lot of people pandering to the black vote. And for the first time, for example, in the South Carolina state legislature, the majority of representatives in the South Carolina legislature are going to be black. A majority black state legislature in South Carolina. That just kind of tells you how, to some white Southerners, it really seemed like the world had been turned upside down during Congressional Reconstruction, and now the slave masters felt like they had been stripped of all their rights and protections, and the slaves had been granted all these rights and protections. So Reconstruction is a really fascinating time in the history of the American South, that is for sure. And that's largely during this time period when Congress was controlling Reconstruction in the South. All right. All right, little interruption there. Sorry. Let's go back to this Congressional Reconstruction Plan. The other three parts of Radical Reconstruction were the Reconstruction Act of 1867. It basically says we're going to divide the whole South into 5 military districts, and the state governments are no longer going to be in charge. We're actually going to have Union troops come down into the South and administer the state as a military government. So this is a very harsh punishment to the South. It basically ties their hands and kind of strips them of their power to rule themselves to any significant degree. Also, they pass a law which is going to ultimately end up in the impeachment of the president. It's called the Tenure of Office Act. What's going on with the Tenure of Office Act is this. There are some more radical, Lincoln had appointed a very diverse cabinet, and there were some rather radical elements on the cabinet, people who were considered radicals who were on the cabinet, and the Congress was afraid that Lincoln was going to fire them off of the cabinet. So as trying to run defense against that, they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act said that Congress cannot, that the president cannot fire members of his cabinet without congressional approval. And Johnson then, of course, takes that bait and he fires one of them. And Congress, therefore, impeaches him for breaking this law. Later, it's clear the Supreme Court rules that the Tenure of Office Act is actually unconstitutional. It confers powers to the Congress that are not originally in the Constitution. But all that doesn't really matter at the time. Instead, what really matters is this, bitter battle for power between the president and Congress. And they impeached the president largely. Technically, they thought that he had broken the Tenure of Office Act, but it became clear that since Johnson hadn't appointed the cabinet member, that the way they had specifically written the law, that since it was Lincoln's cabinet, that technically him firing him did not make the letter of the law in terms of breaking the Tenure of Office Act. And it's kind of confusing. The details aren't really that important. The point is that they impeached the president on what they thought was a valid charge, but ultimately was not. So they finally end up impeaching the president for just conduct unbefitting to office, which just basically means they thought he was an embarrassment as a president. And the people who testify in the trial talk a lot about how he makes off-color jokes and isn't appropriate sometimes. So the impeachment hearings became basically highly politicized and a bit of a joke, really. It's incredible, though, that he escapes impeachment with a single vote. They were a single vote short of actually forcing him out of office as a result of this impeachment attempt. But he does keep his job. But of course, no president really emerges from the impeachment process any stronger. There's only been 2 presidents impeached. That's Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. And neither one of them did their stock really rise as a result of impeachment, no matter how ridiculous the impeachment charges were. The process is just one that generally tends to take a lot of time and wind out of the sails of the president, no matter how popular he might have been, and Johnson certainly did not yield that kind of popularity in the country at the time. So that's what the Tenure of Office Act is all about. They also wanted the 15th Amendment to be ratified, and it was. So I inform you here that he was found not guilty by 1 vote and kept his job. The 15th Amendment said that you could not be prevented from voting simply based on your race, and so basically it is going to allow black men to be allowed to vote for the first time in American history. Women, black or white, still cannot vote, but race cannot be used to keep you from the franchise. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the immediate effects of Reconstruction on African Americans. I hope this is at least, this little lecture here, well not so little, it's been pretty extensive actually, has helped you understand though just kind of the tug of war that goes on after the Civil War between the President and Congress about who's going to be making decisions about the treatment of the South and how the South will re-enter the Union. It really was a very tumultuous time, made more difficult by the assassination of Lincoln and the constant kind of transitions that were happening due to elections, as well as presidential succession in the time period. Okay, see you in class.